Welcome to the office of the Indian Weekender, Mr. Bishop, and thank you so much for making time to meet us.
Great to be here.
You are chair of the National Selection Campaign. How do you respond to people who say that National doesn't really have a big ticket game changer idea, and something new, something fresh?
Yeah, I think we've got lots of fresh new policies, things like building a third medical school, things like a bonding scheme for doctors and nurses, doubling renewable electricity's percentage of the economy. We've got lots of new ideas, but there's no one big thing that's going to rebuild the economy for New Zealand. We need to do lots of different things, and that's what we're very focused on. And the number one thing that people raise with us and talk about is the cost of living. Inflation is 6%, it's treble what it should be. Food prices are up 10%. People's mortgages are going up, so people are really struggling, and people are very focused on the cost of living. They're focused on the economy. They're focused on law and order, and so that's why you hear national candidates and MPs talking so much about those issues. So, if there was a silver bullet for New Zealand, we would fire it. The proverbial silver bullet, but there isn't one. That's the honest truth, and so our campaign is along lots of different things.
So, for cost of living, for instance, what are the biggest things that need to be fixed to get that on track?
Yeah, the first thing is we've got to stop wasteful government spending. So we've seen a government that's increased spending by 80% over the last 6 years, and I just put it to you and to listeners and viewers that government quality of spending is not up 80%. So we've seen a lot of waste inside the system, 14,000 more bureaucrats in Wellington, for example, $55 million spent on a cycle bridge here in Auckland that never got built. So there's a lot of wasteful expenditure by government, and that is driving up the cost of living. So being disciplined about government spending is really important. More migration into New Zealand as well is important. It's an important measure to address the cost of living, and likewise getting the red tape out of farming. It's very difficult to grow vegetables in New Zealand, for example, and that is pushing up vegetable prices, for example. So Labour's solution is GST off fruit and vegetables, which is a boon for the supermarkets, and happy days for them. Most of that won't flow through to actual consumers and just complicates the tax system. So, and of course, tax relief as well. So the average New Zealander will be about $1,000 a year better off under National's tax plan, and all of those things are important. So again, it's not one thing to address the cost of living, it's a whole series of different things.
And how are you feeling about Mr. Luxon's popularity as a PM candidate, given he's not really beating Mr. Hipkins in polls? Are you concerned about that, what's happening on the front?
No, not at all. He's one of the most best performing opposition leaders in New Zealand history. If you look at preferred Prime Minister ratings, if you go back over the last 20 years, traditionally the Prime Minister of the day is almost always in front, and the opposition leader is always behind. And actually the most recent round of polls have them basically neck and neck, 21 and 20%. So by historical standards, he's doing extremely well. And, by definition, the opposition leader tends to get less coverage than the Prime Minister. I'm sure over the next few weeks, as that evens up a bit, as we head into the election campaign period and people start to see the debates and really start to focus, I'm sure those numbers will improve. But at the end of the day, it's the party vote is the one that counts, and that's what changes the government, and we're very focused on that.
And National has also fielded a lot of candidates of Indian origin. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, in many cases, they put their hand up through the National Party selection process and were selected by local delegates. We have a very democratic party structure in the National Party, so every electorate has local branches and local candidate committees, and they selected many of those candidates. Good candidates like Mahesh in Auckland Central, for example, selected by local delegates here in Auckland Central, and he's doing an outstanding job. He's got a tough fight against Close Warwick and a Labour candidate there as well. So, but he's doing a good job. I think about Siva Kalari down in Manurewa, also doing an outstanding job there against a sitting Labour MP. Again, tough seat for him. He's Labour's, I don't think, has ever lost Manurewa, but he's doing an excellent job. I opened his office 3 months ago. Very unusual for a national candidate to have an office open in Manurewa, but he's doing an excellent job. So, we've got very high hopes for them, and the best way to get them into Parliament is to party vote National.
So none of these Kiwi-Indian candidates from National, they aren't contesting from what you would typically call national strongholds. How would you rate their chances on winning the candidate votes?
I think ultimately it's the party vote is the vote that changes the government, and so every national candidate out there, including myself, is campaigning hard for the party vote first and foremost, because that's the ultimate determinant of whether the government changes or not. We do want to do well on the candidate vote as well, and I think Siva is doing an excellent job, as I say. I think Mahesh has a real chance in Auckland Central as well. Some of those other seats will be tougher. I think about Karuna Mutu in Rongotai, for example. That's traditionally been a very strong Labour seat, but he's doing an excellent job as well. We're campaigning hard for a second Mount Victoria tunnel in Wellington, duplicating the tunnel. He's pushing that hard. Ankit Bansal in Palmerston North, for example, is doing hard as well. So I think the last time National won Palmerston North was 1975, or it might have been 1978. So look, these are going to be tough battles for them, but they're working extremely hard. I'm very impressed by all of those candidates.
Now, among the Kiwi-Indian candidates, the best placing, I think, is for Siva Kilari, and that's number 30. Going by the current polling, it's around 36-37%. None of these candidates might actually make it via the list road. What do you feel about that?
I'm very confident that we'll see some Kiwi-Indian candidates for National become members of Parliament after the election, and I think they'll do an outstanding job for National and for the country, actually.
And if you were to come to power, is there a kind of a roadmap, a structured plan to get more representation for ethnic communities, including Kiwi-Indians, in the government? Yeah,
I mean, Christopher Luxon has talked very openly about how we want to diversify the National Party and have people from different backgrounds and different ethnicities as members of the National Party team. And I think you do see that on the list. Obviously, we've got a lot of Kiwi-Indian candidates running and people from other backgrounds as well, and that's really important. And look, it's a work in progress. It's a ever-evolving work in progress, and we've got more work to do.
You're also the housing infrastructure spokesperson. How would you rate the housing scenario right now in New Zealand?
We've got a real housing crisis in New Zealand. Rents are up $175 a week in the last 6 years under Labour. House prices are still unaffordable for very many people, although they've come down quite a bit from the post-COVID highs or the COVID highs. They're still extremely expensive, and we have many people on the wait list. We've got people living in motels, emergency housing right around the country. So things are not where they should be, and in fact they've got worse in the last 6 years. And you've got to remember, Labour came to government promising to fix all of these problems, and actually they've got worse. And that's going to be a real focus for us if we're privileged enough to lead the next government, is sorting out the housing mess that Labour has left.
Labour does have a huge outlay for housing. So if National were to come to power, are you going to kind of stick to that kind of an outlay? Or do you think you have a different strategy to deal with the problem?
I mean, the first thing that we've got to do, I think, is restore interest deductibility for rental property owners. Labour's put in place this rule where landlords can't deduct interest as a legitimate expense. It's created a real cash flow crisis for many landlords and has put pressure on rents. So it's been very counterproductive. It's actually put upward pressure on rents when we want downward pressure on rents. So that's going to be really important. They've also, really struggled with emergency housing. So we have about 6,000 New Zealand families who are living in motels, cost the government $1.4 billion. And there's much better ways to spend that money to get people who are in real housing need into housing, and we're really focused on that. But we also need to go for housing growth, and we've got quite an ambitious and aggressive plan to make councils zone for more housing, but also unlock the infrastructure required to get those houses built, and then reward the communities and the councils that do go for housing growth as well. And in the medium to long term, it's going for housing growth that will solve many of our housing problems. And so we've got a very ambitious set of plans around that, and if we're privileged enough to lead the next government, we'll get on with it.
How would you see the future of housing in big cities like Auckland? Do you think the future is going vertical or spreading out horizontally outwards?
I think it's doing both. There's a balance to be struck here, and we do need to do greater density in Auckland and other cities like Wellington and Christchurch to some extent as well. So more apartments, more terraced housing, and that is happening already to some extent, and we do need to see more of it. We've talked quite openly in the National Party about seeing greater density along transit corridors around bus rapid transit, train stations, things like that. But we also do need to go out at the edge of our city as well. Auckland is a growing city. It needs to grow, it needs to expand, and so it's not one or the other. It's both. We've got a real housing crisis. We need more houses built, and you've got to facilitate the planning environment to allow that to happen.
A lot of homeowners say they are reluctant to put their properties on the rental market because they complain the tenancy laws are pretty harsh on them.
Yes.
How would you describe the current laws, and what is National's plan?
I'd describe them as unbalanced. Mum and dad landlords have been really penalised by this government, and they feel like they're victims. And actually, mum and dad landlords, who are the vast bulk of the landlord market, by the way, mum and dad landlords who typically own one or maybe two rental properties, they're not the enemy, and the government shouldn't treat them as the enemy. They're actually a really important part of the housing market. So we're going to bring back interest deductibility. We're going to take the bright line test back from 10 years down to 2 years. And we are going to bring back these 90-day notice periods where landlords can say, give the tenants 90 days and move people on out of their property. And that will encourage more landlords back into the market, and that's a good thing. It will put downward pressure on rents, and that's ultimately what we want.
And on transport, Labour has batted hard for public transport, and National has traditionally been seen as, shall I say, more empathetic to car ownership and private cars on the roads. What's your plan going forward?
Yeah, I think that's probably the cliched view about the parties, as Labor does public transport, National does roads. The truth is you need to do both, and National's got a strong track record when it comes to public transport. You think about the City Rail Link, which is underway here in Auckland. That was started by National. You think about train upgrades in Wellington, for example. Done significantly under the last National government. So the point is we need to do both, and we've outlined a whole series of roads that we want to build around the country. State Highway 29 in Tauranga. We want to do the East-West link in Auckland. We want to do the 4-lane road up to Whangarei, for example, connecting the north. But we also want to do public transport. So we've talked about completing the Eastern Busway, which is underway. The airport to Botany busway, Northwest Rapid Transit, it's starting as a busway as well, for example. So all of those projects are on our books. Interestingly, the government bagged our roads the other day and then came out and promised to fund many of the ones that we're promising to commit to as well. So the truth is you need to build roads to connect our regions, but in the cities like Auckland and Wellington, you need to build rapid transit.
I have one last question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate National's chances of winning?
I'd say it'd be 7 out of 10. I think I'm cautiously optimistic about how we're going. There's a long way to go, until the election. The campaign is yet to sort of fully get underway. We're tracking pretty well, but we take nothing for granted. We're not complacent. We're working hard every day to try and get out the vote. And what will be on October 14.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bishop. It was great talking to you.
Great to see you.